So not long ago, a Forbes magazine writer, Erica Anderson, did a piece on 7 of the worst business decisions of all time. And I want to share with you some of her findings. She said, number 1, in 1977, the senior executives at 20th Century Fox made an astonishingly short-sighted decision. They signed over all product merchandising rights for any and all Star Wars films to George Lucas in exchange for a mere $20,000 cut in Lucas's studio paycheck. The combined, is right. The combined revenue of Star Wars merchandise over the last several decades have exceeded $3 billion and continues to grow annually, making it the most lucrative deal ever struck between an individual and a corporate studio in entertainment history. In fact, the executives of 20th Century Fox were convinced that they had made a mistake by even allowing George Lucas to make Star Wars. They didn't put it in a whole lot of theaters when it first came out. They thought this is going to be a flop, and it became anything but it. In 1962, the Beatles auditioned at the London office of Decca Records. The executive in charge of talent rejected them. He thought they sounded way too much like that very popular group, the Shadows. You've all heard the Shadows, right? I mean, they're right up there with the Beatles. He told Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, "We don't like your boys' sounds. Groups are out. 4-piece groups with guitars particularly are finished." And well over 2 billion Beatles albums have sold since worldwide. In 1876, William Orton was the president of Western Union, which had a monopoly on the most advanced communications technology available, the telegraph. Orton was offered the patent of a new invention, the telephone, for $100,000, which seemed like an astronomical figure in 1876. The equivalent would be $2 million in today's dollars. He considered the whole idea ridiculous and wrote directly to Alexander Graham Bell, saying the following: "After careful consideration of your invention, while it is a very interesting novelty, we have come to the conclusion that it has no commercial possibilities. What use could this company make of an electrical toy?" Well, 2 years later, after the telephone began to take off, Orton realized the magnitude of his mistake and spent years unsuccessfully challenging Bell's patents. Number 4, the Eastman Kodak Company developed the very first digital camera way back in 1975. Can you believe that? The digital camera had been invented, but Kodak was concerned about the fact that this invention was too good, and so they decided to sit on the invention. At the same time, they had the core technology for the cell phone and decided they better sit on that one as well. They decided not to develop the camera because it would cannibalize their film business. At one point, Kodak held 90% of the U.S. film market share. Well, that's number 4. Number 5 is also Kodak. In the early 80s, Fujifilm entered the U.S. film marketplace with lower-priced film and supplies, but Kodak management believed that U.S. customers would never abandon their hometown brand. In 1984, Kodak passed on the chance to become the official film of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. Fuji won the rights, which gave them a strong foothold in the U.S. market and absolutely catalyzed their growth here. Kodak never fully recovered from these and other poor decisions, and in 2012, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. All right, 2 more. In 1981, Amblin Productions called the Mars Company and offered a simple cross-promotional opportunity. How about if we use M&Ms in our new film, giving you free publicity, and in return, you can promote our film in your packaging? Well, the advertising and marketing folks at Mars said, "No, we think we'll pass." In the film, the extraterrestrial featured instead Reese's Pieces, the not-so-nearly well-known M&M competitor. And Reese's Pieces saw sales jump 65% in the months after the film was released featuring their product. And finally, in the year 2000, Gerald Levin, the chairman of Time Warner, was so confident in the deal that he had managed with America Online that he decided to forego placing a collar on the transaction. A collar enables the seller, in this case Time Warner, to revisit the terms of the transaction if the buyer's stock falls below a certain price. Almost as soon as the merger was announced and before it was completed, the internet bubble burst and AOL shares plunged 50%. Without a collar, Time Warner wouldn't be able to renegotiate the deal. Time Warner execs urged Levin to rethink the deal, but he didn't, and the rest is history. Time Warner shareholders are still paying for his stubbornness. You remember those America Online discs that we used them as coasters in our house, as Frisbee golf? I mean, you could get them anywhere you wanted to get them. Of course, it's easy to see the folly of these decisions in retrospect. The author says hindsight is 20/20, and no one can make the right decision all the time. But I suspect if each of these unfortunate executives had approached these decisions with a little more curiosity, a little more open-mindedness, and a little less certainty about the rightness of their position, we might all be using Western Union Kodak smartphones today. Well, whether it's bad decisions in business or bad decisions in relationships or bad personal decisions or bad decisions made by our country, none of us like when a poor decision is made that impacts us. When I was a seminary student, I was an avid collector of baseball cards. Up to this point in my life, I'd collected baseball cards, and it had worked out pretty well for me. It had been a wise investment. I bought and sold baseball cards. In fact, in high school, I would rent out table space at the baseball card shows at the malls around my house, and I would make money for selling baseball cards. Cards that I bought for pennies, by the time I got to college, were selling for $350 a piece, $250 a piece. I mean, it was amazing what you could get for a Cal Ripken rookie or a Mark McGwire rookie card. And so I thought, as I got ready to get married, I'd just take this investment to the next level. I'd use baseball cards to help pay for college. They helped pay for a trip to Hawaii in my junior year of college, and they helped me buy my wife's wedding ring. And so I had a pretty good history here. Only problem was we got married in the early 90s, and the baseball card market became saturated in the early 90s. One of my worst investments in baseball cards was to bet on a guy named Randy Tomlin, who was a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates. He graduated from my college. I was able to get his cards for 3 cents a piece. I bought 500 of them, knowing that those 3-cent piece cards would become at least $25 a piece. I was just convinced of this. And today there are about 450 of those cards sitting in my house that are worth about 2 cents a piece today. And so even your pastors made some pretty lousy investments over my days. When we left the book of Joshua last week, the Israelites were once again in an upswing. After a sobering defeat to the city of Ai due to the sin of one man, a guy named Achan, God had allowed the children of Israel to experience just incredible defeat, but then showed them grace. And they defeated Ai after God forgave them of their sin. The people of Israel, you could say, as we enter Joshua chapter 9, are in a spiritual high. God had forgiven them their foolishness, their acting out without seeking Him, and their blatant sin. So you might expect that the Israelites will have learned their lesson, that they will move forward into victory. But these are the descendants of men and women who were held in captivity in Egypt and disobeyed God time and time and time again in the wilderness. And they're also the descendants of somebody that you and I are descendants of. They're descendants of the man named Adam and the woman named Eve, who the Bible tells us in the New Testament it was through one man that sin entered the world. And theologically, every one of us have been guilty of sin. So you and me make some of the same mistakes we see the children of Israel making over and over again. Spiritual victory is followed oftentimes by this incredibly stupid thing. They succumb to sin, or they don't learn the lesson, and they make the same mistakes again. And if you're like me, you read the Old Testament and you read the chronicles of these children of Israel, and you get a little bit frustrated with them. You say, why can't you learn? What is it about you that continues to make the same mistakes again and again and again? And then you realize, well, we're kind of guilty of the same thing, aren't we? We're guilty of making sometimes the exact same mistakes. Well, let's look at how Joshua chapter 9 opens. Children of Israel, spiritual high, major victory at Ai. As soon as the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland, all along the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua in Israel. Now let's stop there for a moment. What we're seeing now is just how great the reputation of God and the Jewish people has become in the land of Canaan. So amazing is this reputation that the author of Joshua talks about the 6 main people groups that are left that they have to do battle with in the southern part of the territory that they're going to attack, and says that they are banding together. They've decided it's time for us to come together if we have any hope of defeating the Israelites. Now, when I was in junior high, I went to camp. I told you last week we began with a story about Camp Timberley where I went to camp. And I had a speaker there once that was teaching through an Old Testament book, and he said, guys, if you want a great cut down for somebody, you just look at them and say, hey, your mama's a Hittite, all right? And I didn't think it was that great. I kind of like your mama's a Jebusite better. But anyway, there's a bunch of people, Hittites and Jebusites and Canaanites and Perizzites, who are all coming together to fight against the children of Israel. But before that battle occurs, something interesting happens. Look at verse 3. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their own part acted with cunning, and they went and made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes. And all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us. So let's stop here. The Gibeonites are the Hivite people. If we go to the next slide, we're back to that map again. Gibeon is located right here on the slide. You don't see Ai here. They've already defeated Ai. Ai is only 7 miles away from Gibeon. It's like going from here to Lake Elmo. All right, this is not far from where they've been. It's about 9 miles northwest of Jerusalem here, just to give you a little picture in what would be modern-day Israel. The Gibeonites are known as the Hivite people. They're one of those groups of people that God has orchestrated that the children of Israel would eliminate. Now, you might say that God is kind of orchestrating a clash of clans between his people and the residents of Canaanite. Now, some of you are saying, what in the world is clash of clans? But this entire section of students can tell you what it is, all right? And so, guys, I want you to picture Clash of Clans, God style, okay? And he has determined that the people who live in this region are to be eliminated. And again, that seems really strange to us living in the 21st century. That sure doesn't sound like a God of grace, and we've talked about it multiple times in this series. But this is a people whose wickedness was on par with those who lived in the day of Noah. They are people who took their very names after Cain and are people who were doing everything that they could to fight against God and his will, and God determined in his righteousness that they occupied the land where the children of Israel would live, and that they were to be eliminated. And it really is a tough thing to read. And so you come into chapter 9 expecting that that's what's going to happen here. That Israel is just going to come off this fight with Ai, clash of clans, God style is going to happen, and the next group is going to be eliminated. But instead, there's this kind of parenthesis to the story. And so before the battle takes place, a great deception is about to take place. The Gibeonites decided that fighting against Israel was useless. Israel's God was too strong. They had defeated Jericho and Ai, and it's only a matter of time before they're going to be beat too. So the writer of Joshua says something interesting. In verse 4, he says that they literally acted with cunning. The Gibeonites became method actors here. They portrayed themselves as weary, as destitute, as these poor refugees. Even though they only lived 7 miles away from Ai, they pretended to be from another place. They put on tattered clothing. They put on worn-out sacks in their donkeys. They brought this bread that was dry and crumbly and probably moldy and pretended like it was all that they had to eat, and they had baked it long ago, and they just needed the mercy of the Israelite people. They came to them wanting a peace treaty, an oath, a promise that Israel would aid them. in a sense, they played a trick that was similar to the one that Israel played on Ai. They deceived their enemy with some pretty good acting. I could just picture that. Can you picture it too? Or they're sitting there 7 miles away, so how are we going to fool them? How are we going to pretend that we're from somewhere else and we're desperate? Well, we can't wear the clothes we're wearing. We got to mess these clothes up. Let's bake some bread and let's let it get dry and let's let it get a little bit moldy and we'll go deceive them. Yesterday I went deer hunting for the first time in my life. I really feel Minnesotan now that I have sat in a deer stand and not shot a deer, but experienced and endured the cold. And actually it was just a wonderful weekend with my boys, Jeremy and Zach, and Eric Ramsdale invited us up to hunt with him. And so my boys are, really into this, and they got their license, and Jeremy had a couple of shots, and Zach and I saw one doe the whole day, and it just ran by us. There wasn't even a chance to take a shot at it, and some of you are like, good, Bambi's alive. That's great. Our pastor's not a murderer. And, I understand that some of you are there, and others of you are like, oh, yeah, hunting season. Here's the deal. So we went out twice yesterday. So we got up at 4:30 in the morning, and we dressed warm. And Eric said, make sure you bring long johns. So I had those embarrassing, white long johns I put on, and I had my blue jeans, and I put about 4 layers on the top of me, and I had my gloves on, and I had my hat. I had that hat that looks like Elmer Fudd, that Minnesota hat you only wear when you're, going hunting, and people make fun of you, but it's so warm, and it was just great. And so I'm in the deer stand with Zach at 4:30 in the morning, and we're waiting for the sun to rise, and it is just cold. And the wind is whipping, and every sound you hear, you think you hear a deer. And it is just cold. I mean, just really cold. And by 9 o'clock, Zach and I are thinking, do you think Eric will think we're not men if we go inside and just say we've had enough? And so I said, yeah, I think he will. And so we better stay out here, and we'll look like we're from Illinois or something and not Minnesotan. And so we stayed out a little bit longer and stayed as long as we could. And finally we went inside, and Eric said to me at lunchtime, he said, Brian, you aren't dressed warm enough. I said, what do you mean I'm not dressed warm? I got long johns. I put some more layers on. So I put some pajama pants on underneath my jeans, and I put an extra pair of wool socks on. So I had 2 pairs of wool socks. I had some tennis shoes on, and then I put 4 or 5 more layers on top of me. You should have seen me. I was like the Michelin, man out there yesterday, all right? And I looked like I picture these people looking. I mean, there was no pride in what I was wearing yesterday, all right? I was doing whatever it took to stay warm, and the clothing looked absolutely ridiculous. And these method actors came with this ridiculous disguise to try to somehow secure a peace treaty with the children of Israel in hopes that they wouldn't be eliminated. Look at verse 7. But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us, then how can we make a covenant with you? So, how do we know you're who you say you are? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? And they said to him, from a very distant country your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon and to Og the king of Bashan who lived in the Ashtaroth. So our elders and our inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. Here is our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day that we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. Did you hear that? Took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. What did they get in trouble for in Ai? Moving forward without seeking counsel from the Lord, amongst other things. And Joshua made a peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore to them. Notice how well the Gibeonites thought their deception through. When they talked about God and they talked about the Jewish people, they didn't even mention the events at Jericho and Ai. They mentioned events that happened years before. They instead referred to battles won by the ancestors of these people, battles won before they entered the Promised Land. They deferred to Yahweh as well, speaking highly of Israel's God. They played the sympathy card. Perhaps they knew of the command that the Israelites were given by Moses to treat foreigners with peace, especially if they honored Yahweh and wanted peace. They certainly didn't act like Canaanites, and I want to stop there for a second. You see, some of us read the Old Testament, and we think that God in the Old Testament is just this warmonger that wants the children of Israel to kill nation after nation after nation. And actually, it's the Canaanite people, and that's it. And I've said it multiple times in this series. After Joshua, you don't see God responding that way. And well before they enter the land of Canaan, in Deuteronomy 20, Moses gives the children of Israel commands on how they're to treat foreigners, how they're to treat people of other lands. And he tells them to treat them with respect. If they have needs, to bless them. Remember, way back in the Abrahamic covenant, God said that the descendants of Abraham would be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. You see, that was his plan. They were to welcome the refugee. They were to welcome the stranger. Those passages that we talk about on Refugee Sundays like today when we focus on the refugees are passages that come from the Old Testament. God very much cared about how the children of Israel would treat those who had needs. And maybe the Gibeonites knew that. Maybe the Gibeonites knew of the command from Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 20. So Joshua and the leaders of the congregation, which is an interesting term for Israel that's used in this chapter. And so they've been called the children of Israel, they've been called the Israelites, now they're being called the congregation, almost like they're a church. So the leaders of the congregation, which is the leaders of Israel, and Joshua discuss what's happening. They don't know for sure who the Gibeonites are. They choose not to talk to God, and they swear an oath to them. They make a quick decision. Yeah, and perhaps it's because the people were standing right in front of them. Maybe you've done something like that before. You felt like you were forced to make a decision quickly, and you felt like maybe I should pray about this before I do it. But because the people were right in front of you and they looked needy, or because your boss was saying he needed an answer right away, or because there was a deadline that was looming and you just felt like you didn't have the time to give it to prayer, you just made a decision and made it work. You flipped a coin, you decided, hey, this is what I'm going to do, but you didn't go to God. You see, we learned an important principle here. After great victories in our spiritual lives, we can easily succumb to stupidity. We can begin to believe that we've arrived. Why wouldn't Joshua and the people have sought God? This was the problem with the attack at Ai. In their folly, they planned an attack without seeking God, and they find themselves in more trouble, and now they do it again. And how many of us can relate? I was in my office a couple years ago, and my phone rang. It rings a lot here at church, and in the afternoon, Linda is normally gone by 2 o'clock, and so she had left for the day. Darren was out of town, and so I picked up the phone. And on the other end of the phone was a guy who told me he'd visited our church a couple weeks before with his wife, and that they were moving here from Ohio to Minnesota. And on their way, on the move, their car had broken down. They had spent all of their money on their move. Was there any way the church could help them out? And our LoveLink account was diminished, they were depleted. We just didn't have money in the LoveLink account to help them. And I asked him some questions. He even told me what I preached on that Sunday. So I thought, okay, that's probably legitimate. They were up here looking for a house, visited our church. He told me, we can't wait to be a part of Woodbury Community Church, and we're looking so forward to it. But we're just desperate. We're at a spot, our car broke down, I'm in a Kmart, I'm in the auto shop. Is there any way that you can help me? And I said, well, how much is your repair? He said, it's $100. I said, we had a decent week. I didn't call my wife. I didn't ask, the Lord for advice. I just kind of believed their story. And I said, okay, sure, I'll help you out. And I said, great, can you wire the money to Kmart? And I said, what do you mean wire the money to Kmart? Can I just pay with a credit card over the phone? He goes, no, this Kmart requires you to wire. And so he puts me on the phone with the manager of the auto shop at Kmart. And I get in Google and I look up the number, and sure enough, it's the right address, it's the Kmart. And I'm thinking, well, this is weird, but all right. So I just did it. I wired him the money, $100 to fix his car. And about 20 minutes later, Pastor, I forgot about tax. I promise you I'm going to pay you when we move to the church, and I'll pay you back, and I'm starting this new job, and I promise I'll pay you back, but I need $40 more for tax. And I said, all right. So I wire him again. It cost money to wire, but I did it. And because something in me just felt like he was legit, and I felt pressured, and I felt like here's a real need in front of me, and I just didn't take the time to pray about it. And 2 years later, I still haven't seen that guy in church, ever in church. Ouch, all that money, thinking I was doing something good. And I guarantee you, had I stopped and prayed and thought about it and said, this just doesn't jive, I wouldn't have been taken. You see, we get calls every week at church from con artists sometimes who just want to use the church. And so I'm pretty good at sniffing that out normally. He just fooled me with some stuff. Probably went on our website, looked at what I'd been preaching on, said I was there 2 weeks ago, saw the topic, and I fell for the charade. And Israel did a similar thing. See, sometimes when we hurry to make a quick decision, we make a poor decision. Making quick decisions without seeking God first almost always has bad consequences. Israel did that, and at first glance, it looks like they've screwed up big time. The Gibeonites feel clever. The Israelites are about to feel incensed. And we don't know yet how God feels about this whole thing. Cleverness depends, by the way, on what side of the ruse you're on, doesn't it? And so not long before, Israel had been the clever ones, and they had fooled Ai, and they told Ai that they were coming with their whole army to attack him from the front, and really had a whole lot more soldiers in the back ready to destroy the city. And they felt pretty clever in that ruse. Now they didn't. Verse 16 says, at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. So they were Canaanite people. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon. Gibeon was just one of the Hivite cities. Cherepeth, Beeroth, and Kiriath-Jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders, but all the leaders said to the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath that we swore to them. And the leaders said to them, let them live. So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said to them. Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, why did you deceive us, saying, we are very far from you when you dwell among us? Now therefore you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. They answered Joshua, because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded to his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. And now behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight, do to us. Do it. So he did this to them and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and the altar of the Lord to this day in the place that he should choose. 3 days after the Gibeonites tricked the Israelites into a peace treaty, the ruse is discovered, and the people of Israel are incensed at their leaders. When leaders make poor decisions, there's almost always a crisis of confidence. It happens in nations, it happens in companies, it happens in churches, and it happens in homes. The Israelites were afraid of what God would do. They had made a commitment to follow God, and God said to annihilate the Canaanites. But they'd also made a commitment to keep any oath that they made in the name of Yahweh. They were stuck. To break the oath in Yahweh's name was considered one of the most grievous sins that a man could commit. A nation surely couldn't commit that crime. In the wilderness wanderings, do you remember what happened? The nation of Israel would grumble. They'd grumble against their leaders. They'd grumble against God. They'd say, I wish we were back in Egypt. We had it so much better in Egypt. And it was complain. And so in the wilderness wanderings, it was the children of Israel that were guilty of poor judgment, and the leaders who exercise judgment. Well, here we've got leaders guilty of poor judgment, and the nation of Israel, or the congregation, if you will, that's holding their leaders accountable. How could the leaders be so foolish as to not consult Yahweh in this matter? We might expect that God is going to act harshly toward Israel as we move to Joshua chapter 10. But you know what? I'm going to give you a little insight into next week's lesson. God doesn't act harshly. Instead, God's going to give Israel a major victory over every one of those nations in the southern campaign. Why? Because there's something that we can all learn from this Gibeonite deception. Unlike every other people group that God commanded the Israelites to annihilate, the Gibeonites had respect for Yahweh. They were like Rahab, that prostitute who lived in the town of Jericho, whom was the only one that God showed mercy to as Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Rahab and her family were spared because of the faith that Rahab had in Yahweh. She believed and feared God. The Gibeonites do the same thing. They didn't know God in a personal way, but they knew of him. And based on what they knew about him, they feared him. They knew that Yahweh had ordered their destruction. And instead of rising up in war and fighting the Israelites in war, the Gibeonites offered peace, albeit in deception. They feared for their lives, and they saw the grace of the Jewish people and the grace of God as their only hope. This is the second example we have in the book of Joshua where God's grace is shown even to those most undeserving of it. He allowed the Gibeonites to live, and not only to live, but to serve in worship of Jehovah by cutting wood and gathering water for the congregation for the altar of the Lord. Some of you might say, well, that looks like slavery. Well, yeah, it does look like slavery. And yet at the same time, the position that God gave to these people was the position that put them nearest to the temple, would put them nearest to the priest, and would put them nearest to the worship of God, a place where they would learn to understand just who Jehovah was. People who were far from God were brought near to him, and God has always delighted in doing that. Robert Hubbard shares a beautiful story in his commentary on the book of Joshua. It's a story about the church that Dave Haveman grew up in, Calvary Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where a guy named Ed Dobson serves as pastor. Ed Dobson was a traditional older pastor of this traditional church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he led his church in a 4-month experiment several years ago called Saturday Night Live. It was a Saturday night worship service geared for street people, prostitutes, and the homeless near the church. Before beginning, Ed warned the Sunday morning crowd that they might not want to attend Saturday night services. He said the music was going to offend them. He said that the talk was just going to be a 15-minute talk about God, not the typical 50-minute sermon that he preached every week to the congregation. He said that he was going to pass out 3x5 cards for the people to ask questions, and he would patiently answer as many, if not all of the questions every Saturday night. The people would put their names in the card, and Ed would answer them. And so what he did with the Sunday morning crowd is said, don't come, but pray. Pray for the service and pray for the people that are going to come here. Pray for the experiment, and the experiment began. The street people audience and over-the-top music and short talk about God and question and answer time was just as Ed had said. But during the first 2 months, Ed was dumbfounded to see 3 ladies from the Sunday morning congregation up in the balcony every Saturday night. Finally, he went up one night to find out why. Oh, Pastor, it's about the questions, one said. About the questions? What do you mean it's about the questions? You know the answers to these questions. You've been Christians longer than I've been a Christian. No, Pastor, they said. It's about the names. We write down the names that you read in the cards, and every Tuesday morning in our prayer group, we pray for each name. We pray for their salvation. After 4 months, 20 people had received eternal life through the Saturday night service and the prayers of those 3 ladies. The church voted to continue the experiment, and eventually it became a church plant of its own, a church plant that continues to thrive today. Surrounded by a growing sea of contemporary Gibeonites, Joshua would call churches today to engage in our own creative outreach strategies. You know, Hubbard's right. we do live in a time where we're surrounded by Gibeonites. We're surrounded, you and me, every day in our neighborhoods, where we work, in our homes, by people who have heard about God. They have seen, at times, glimpses of Christians truly living out what it says that they say. They've seen hypocrisy, to be sure, but they don't know God personally. May we never stop doing what it takes to bring people who are far from God close to Him. Now we know that it's God's Holy Spirit that does that work. It's God's Holy Spirit that draws people, but somehow, mysteriously, He has chosen to have you and me involved in that work. And so may we say yes to Jesus, partnering with Him to make that happen. May God use us all this week. Let's pray. God, we thank You for the story of the Gibeonites. We thank You that there's this great parenthesis in Joshua where You, who had called Your children to annihilate an entire race of people, something that kind of turns our stomachs today, Lord, showed incredible grace and restraint. Lord, You allowed an entire group of people to be brought near to You, to even get to serve in Your temple, in Your tabernacle, to come alongside and to experience worship. Father, would You help us as Your congregation to learn from the mistakes and the sins of our past? Would You help us to not continue to go to the same well over and over again that just ends up leaving us empty? God, may people, when they see us, not see hypocrisy, but may they see You. God, would You use us to be Your ambassadors in reaching this generation for Jesus Christ? In Your Son's precious and holy name we pray. Amen.